Installment of the Bible and Education. Remember that this is a series that is being run by the Berean Academy, and we're being broadcast by Gatekeepers. Our show airs every Friday at 7:30 p.m. Tonight, we're doing it on a special night because I am traveling and I'm spending time with these great people at a conference, including the pastor Devon Williams from San Diego, California, who's with me. Hello.
Yes, how you doing?
And so we're doing it a little bit off in terms of we're recording this on a beautiful Tuesday night, and then we will be airing it again on Friday at 7:30 p.m. But it's not exactly as live as it usually is. So today we're talking about Judges and Joshua, which we did last week. In a lot of ways, would you agree with this? Joshua is a how-to book in terms of education. There's so much in that shows you great virtues that educators can have. It teaches about courage in Joshua 1:9.
Yes, definitely.
And the whole idea of the memorial stones that shows about how we have to educate people, how God wants us to pass down our history and our memory in tangible ways, right? There's so many things in Joshua that are rich with educational insight. Judges is a how not to book. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. After Judges, when we look at the book of Judges, we want to look at some things concerning Moses as well. And so, yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, I think that with the book of Judges, what we find is this is a time period in Israel's history, which often does not get as much attention as other time periods because it's a long period. It's about 430 years, 450 years that Israel is not ruled by a king. It's not really ruled by a functioning priesthood either. Would you agree with that?
I agree, yep.
And instead, what we have is this series of people who don't have a clear order of succession. They're picked by God to respond to a certain crisis in the moment, and then they judge Israel. They lead. It looks back a little bit to the judges that were set up in Exodus 18 by Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. But it's not a period that really reflects good leadership. And I think to the extent that education comes from leadership, I would describe this book as a how not to book. And we're going to get into a little bit of the specifics of why I say that. You might not totally agree with this, but what I see is everything that the judges do, even at their best, even if you're looking at Ehud, even if you were looking at Gideon, they're still not good educators.
Yeah, I think some of the things that you can see from the book of Judges, they teach principles of overcoming challenges more than educating the people. I think their investment was after coming through the wilderness, after being Joshua taking over for Moses, and then the book of Judges, like you're saying, they were coming through so many physical challenges that sometimes when you get into challenges, that becomes your identity. And I think that's what I see when I look in the book of Judges, because you can see that the majority of the teaching, even though they had several kings and people that were in leadership for a period of time, very short period of time, none of them that really established a foundation of success.
Right. Yeah, they didn't pass on the set of values. They didn't keep alive the law. This kind of helps you to understand why many years later, 1,000 years later, Josiah is in this weird position where they discover the Bible that had been forgotten, because this is the time period when there's just a huge neglect of that job that was so clear in the book of Joshua that you have to pass things down.
And
remember in Deuteronomy how Moses said we have to constantly teach and repeat the law. And we don't see that happening. So it's an interesting thing to look at. Now, there's a lot of specifics with Judges because this is a very plot-driven book of the Bible. There's a lot of very specific plot things that happen. We don't have a lot of repetition, but instead we have a lot of fast action. But I would like to start with some of the judges that and this may shock you Bible readers out there, you good Christians, because we're not saying that Gideon's not a hero. We're not saying that Samson's not a godly man. We're saying that as teachers, where did they fall short? That is the biggest thing, is that they're not able to really leave a mark that passes things on to the next generation. Now, let's talk about Ehud. Now, what's interesting about Ehud is he's the ambidextrous guy who can use his right hand and his left hand, and that's what allows him to kill Eglon, right? Because you reach that with one hand, with the other he pulls out the dagger.
Right.
So I know this is going to sound like a little bit of a stretch, but trust me, I think that this is a valid insight. Did you notice how Ehud, that seems to be a gift or a skill that comes to him as an individual, but he doesn't learn it from anyone and he doesn't pass it on to anyone? Do you know what I'm saying? Like his ability to deliver Israel was the death blow was totally based on him having this secret trick in the moment. But it's not something that he passed on. It wasn't an art or craft.
I never looked at it like that, but he never I when I read the story, I understood. I never read that deep into it to where he was really responsible for passing it on. But I think it was a skill that he probably practiced within himself. I don't think he actually had a plan to pass that on.
It just came in the moment, right?
Yeah.
Here, let me read a little bit of this because it's such an interesting thing. Now, Origen, who was an ancient theologian, he read this and he interpreted the ambidextrous nature of Ehud as having a deeper meaning about people's ability of flexibility, or that there was some larger message in it. But this is what it says: Ehud made himself a double-edged sword, 18 inches long.
That's 22.
Yeah, this is 3:16.
3:16. Okay.
He strapped it to his right thigh under his clothes and brought the tribute to Eglon, the king of Moab, who was an extremely fat man. When Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he dismissed the people who had carried it. At the carved images near Gilgal, he returned and said, "King Eglon, I have a secret message for you." The king called for silence, and all his attendants left him. Then Ehud approached him while he was sitting alone in his room upstairs, where it was cool. Now, some people have interpreted that as a toilet. Have you ever heard this?
Yes.
That the base, and this would explain why else would a king dismiss all of his guards? Because he's
in his private time.
And Ehud said, "I have a word from God for you." And the king stood up from his throne. Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and plunged it into Eglon's belly. Even the handle went in after the blade, and Eglon's fat closed in over it so that Ehud did not withdraw the sword from his belly, and Eglon's insides came out. Ehud escaped by way of the porch, closing and locking the doors of the upstairs room behind him. Okay, so he was able to deliver Israel from the Moabite king because of this, but this seems to me, this sets the tone, I think, for a lot of the judges, where they have some special gift to deliver it, and then what I would say is that they don't follow through once they get into power. They have some special insight, but they don't, like as I said, they don't pass it on, and part of it is because nobody passed on to them, it seems, the book of wisdom or the book of the law. They're not being instructed, so there is no system in place of sharing people's heritage or sharing the law. How would you read that?
Yeah, I mean, when I look at that verse, verse 24, and it says, after Ehud went out, Eglon's advisors came in. And we talked about that position, that it was more of a, because it says here, I'm reading from the God's Word translation, which is a little different. It says they were surprised that the doors were locked. He must be using the toilet.
So your version is straight up about it. Your version doesn't play any games, doesn't mince any words. Okay, right.
And they said they waited and waited, but Eglon didn't open the doors. So they took the key and opened the door. They were shocked to see their ruler lying on the floor dead.
Right.
And so, like you said earlier, they were not aware that he was going to use this weapon that he had concealed.
Well, because he did. Yeah. And he was smart enough to hide it. I don't know where his skirt or his tunic would have parted, whatever, but it seems like because he took it with his left hand out from his right thigh, so it was almost also like that was an element of surprise as well.
Mhm.
And he was giving the tribute, remember, with one hand, and then with the other hand, he took it. So he was ambidextrous. But that it seems as though that was his gift for the moment, and he was the right man at the right time to kill Eglon.
Yeah.
But then what became of him? Did he pass on any wisdom about being a ruler, or did he pass on any of his secrets of how he thought of this? Because that's a very crafty man who could come up with a trick like that.
Well, I mean, just think about it in today's.
Yeah.
Let's say you, as an individual, had the opportunity to inflict a death blow on a sitting president.
Right.
I don't think that would be something that you would be interested in passing on to another generation.
Right.
Because there would be consequences.
Right.
If I look at it like that, from that aspect. But I think, just like you said, most of the teachings in the book of Judges is not teachings that were rooted in the people that were going to succeed.
Right. Yeah.
I think, like you said, because they had so many people sitting on the throne, getting off the throne, so many people in authority taking over. I think from my way of looking at it is, it was a time like a free for all. In other words, everybody was doing pretty much their own thing.
In fact, that's the line that repeats again and again, is that there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. That there was no, and that just goes to show you that we do want to give people liberty, as we keep on hearing, right? We want people to have free will and free conscience, but in the absence of sound teaching, that doesn't work, right? Because even if you have one moment of liberty, you lose your liberty in the next generation. Which just keeps on happening throughout the book of Judges. The next person who comes along is Deborah, right? Because Ehud, as you can probably guess, Ehud was, after Ehud, Israel was peaceful for 80 years, and then Shamgar came, and he delivered Israel by striking down 600 Philistines with an ox goad. And then, of course, they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And then they fell under the forces of Sisera. He was the one who was ruling over them. And then Deborah, now what do you make of, there are many women who love the figure of Deborah, right? Because this is the chapter of the book where not only do you have Deborah, but then you have Yael, right? So you have these two women who are powerful, strong women who deliver the Israel from King Sisera, because Deborah, remember, is when she leads the troops into battle. She sings her song of victory, but Yael is the one who actually drives the tent peg through his head by tricking him. When they're in Deborah, the tent with Yael. How do you read? Is this a sign of, we have these brave women, or is it that there's something going wrong with the men in Israel during all this? Because remember that Barak doesn't want to go with Deborah.
Right. Barak said to her, "If you go with me, I'll go." In verse number 8.
Right.
That's what you're saying. And then he said, but if you don't go with me, I won't go. Deborah replied, "Certainly I will go with you, but you won't win any honors. For the way you are going about this is because the Lord will use a woman to defeat Sisera."
Right.
So that kind of gives us some insight into it.
Right.
That the women had came to a place of great strength. Because you have a man who is now at pretty much on the same level, but he's refusing to go without her.
Right. Yeah.
So he had great confidence that if I travel with Deborah, there's going to be a tremendous advantage to me. And he said, if she don't go, I'm not going. And Deborah was trying to get him to go without her.
Right.
Because she wanted him to get the credit.
And of course, the twist about that is that you hear that and you think it's because Deborah's going to get the honor, but it's not. It's Yael, the other woman. Right? So it's kind of like an interesting twist. Now, the name Barack is certainly not a name marred in shame. We had a president named Barack Obama, right? There was a president of Israel named Barack. I forget his last name, but there was a Barack that was a leader there as well. So it's not like we're ashamed of the figure of Barack. But when I read it, I'm a little bit shocked that he had to, that he was so dependent on Deborah. He couldn't ride out and lead the troops himself. So to me, that is he's not very inspiring as a leader. I mean, they managed to liberate Israel from Sisera, but there's something that kind of lacking in your leadership if, as a man, you can't lead without you.
Well,
I mean,
you might get yourself in trouble.
Why is that?
With the women, I'm saying.
Well, how do you? Well, I mean, we have ladies in the. How do you interpret that the fact that Barak won't go unless Deborah goes?
Well, I don't want to interpret it. I interpret it as a dependence, and I don't know if it was. I just sometimes for support.
Right.
I didn't interpret it as if
he was incapable.
Right.
He was incapable.
Well, I see it kind of like he was incapable because as a man, I'm talking as a man. I know sometimes as men, we don't like to let on that we like to have somebody with us.
Right.
And especially during this most difficult time.
Yeah.
He was reaching out. And I know sometimes with my wife, when I want to go certain places, I don't come out directly and tell her, hey, I need you to go with me. Because men by nature don't want to always express their fears.
Right.
Or their concerns. Could be another, if it's not really fear. But so sometimes you'll try to go through the back door with the woman and say, hey, I want you to go with me.
Right.
And so I think for sure he was expressing his lack of confidence.
Yes, that's how I see it, is that he had a lack of confidence. And I think it's in keeping with this whole era. And I think that's why the failure that we're talking about, which is that every time you get a deliverer, they can do the job, but then the next generation, it's already lost. All of their progress is lost. It's because they don't have a real sound means of passing on whatever their wisdom or the secrets of their victory to the next person. I mean, in some ways, I know there's no luck in the Bible, right? It's all providence. But in some ways, if it weren't for the fact that Yael, a woman from whom you wouldn't necessarily expect that kind of bravery, she tricks Sisera by saying, "Oh, do you want some milk?" And then she puts a carpet over his head and then drives his temple with a tent peg. If it weren't for that, then would Sisera have even been overthrown? And so that it seems as though it wasn't part of his leadership or part of his organization or part of his planning. It was God's will that they would be delivered. But they themselves, in terms of whatever power they had of their own, they didn't have a means of passing down a system of government to the next group of people. And, we've talked a lot at this conference about self-government. And I think that what happens is a lot of these judges, even though they have moments of heroism and even though they do the job and they deliver Israel, they don't really seem to have a lot of self-government, do they?
No, because you can see the self-government, the whole essence of it is you have things in your life under control. Right. And we don't see that with many other people that we're talking about. Like you mentioned Gideon, mentioned Samson. Self-government means that you at first have things in your life managed and in control. And then that's what gives you the authority then to help lead and judge other people.
Right.
And so we know from the scriptures that was challenges. I think it was a challenge during that era, as well as a challenge in individuals' lives. And that's why when you mentioned Josiah earlier, it's such a fitting statement to make when somebody at 8 years old comes in and he has in his mind and in the minds of the people already mastered self-discipline.
Right, yeah.
And self-governing at 8 years old.
And he does manage to bring reforms across. I mean,
exactly.
He's thorough. Now, you mentioned Gideon, and I'd like to talk about him.
Okay.
We could go over all of the great acts of heroism of Gideon because, we've named the Gideon Bible after Gideon. Everyone loves Gideon, Gideon's trumpets and all of his men. But let's take a look at Gideon's legacy. Let's take a look at how he did as a teacher, as an educator, as someone to give people a lasting legacy. In Judges 8:22, we hear this. chapter 8, verse 22.
Okay.
Now, Gideon this is something where we see a moment of such incredible articulate wisdom on the part of Gideon, followed by something that is so disappointing. So I'm just going to read this.
8:22.
Yeah, from Judges 8:22. We have Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, because they asked Gideon to be king. He says, I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. Now, isn't that a great thing of wisdom?
I would think so.
This is obviously a man who has very deep insights. But then look what happens, okay? Let me make a request of you. Everyone give me an earring from his plunder. Now the enemy had gold earrings because they were Ishmaelites. They said, we agreed to give them. So they spread out a mantle, and everyone threw an earring from his plunder on it. The weight of the gold earrings he requested was 43 pounds of gold. In addition to the crescent ornaments and ear pendants, the purple garments on the kings of Midian, and the chains on the necks of the camels. Gideon made an ephod from all this and put it all in Ophrah, his hometown. Then all Israel prostituted themselves with it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his household. So Midian was subdued before the Israelites, and they were no longer a threat. The land was peaceful 40 years during the days of Gideon. Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, son of Joash, went back to live at his house. He had 70 sons, his own offspring, since he had many wives. His concubine, who was in Shechem, bore him a son, and he was named Abimelech. Then Gideon, son of Joash, died of a ripe old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah. When Gideon died, the Israelites turned and prostituted themselves with the Baals and made Baal-berith their god. The Israelites did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the power of the enemies around them. How do you go? That is in so few verses. You go from such a height of wisdom like that. It just disappears. I mean, how did that happen? And his own sons, I mean, he says, my sons are not going to rule over you, but I mean, who would want to be ruled over by his sons? He can't even educate his own sons. His sons, maybe he had too many sons, he had too many wives. I don't know. How do you read it, the whole thing?
Well, let me go back and read just a few from the I like the New Living Translation.
Okay.
Because I think it helps people for where they are right now.
Right. Yeah.
It says, the men of Israel said to Gideon, verse 22, you then, your son, and then your grandson must rule us. You rescued us from Midian. Gideon replied, I will not rule over you, in verse 23, nor will my son. The Lord will rule you. Then Gideon said to them, do me a favor. That's a problem. Because the moment Gideon began to speak from his own intellect,
right, yes,
it proved to you that his first statement had nothing to do with his character. Because the first thing Gideon asked for was gold to build a worship for idols.
I know. It's almost like he's saying, I don't want to be your king because I don't want to be held accountable for, I just want to go off and I don't want the responsibility of it all or something like that.
He said, do me a favor. Each of you give me an earrings from your loot. The enemies, the Ishmaelite, wore gold earrings.
Right, yeah.
Now, that's a mouthful. The men of Israel answered, yes, we'll give them to you. So they spread out a coat. Each man took the earrings from his loot and dropped on it. The gold earrings Gideon asked for weighed 40 pounds.
That's a lot of gold.
That's a lot of gold.
That's a lot of gold. Yeah.
From earrings now.
Right.
Because you imagine how much, I mean, I've never worn an earring personally myself. My wife wears plenty of them. But I don't know of any earring wearing. Most earrings weigh a few ounces, if that.
Right, yeah.
And he picked up 40 pounds of it. And then it said, listen to this one. It says, including the moon ornaments, the earrings, the purple clothes worn by the kings of Midian, and the chains of their camels' necks. Then Gideon used the gold to make an idol and placed it in his hometown of Ophrah.
Wow. Now, to me, what this speaks to is this just drives home to me the importance of everything that we're doing here.
Yeah.
which is that you can do great things for the kingdom. You can deliver people. You can save nations. You can put down tyrants. But if you don't have a way of passing down the value system, of keeping the hanging on to the legacy, it all disappears. And I think that's why I think Joshua is a how-to book and Judges is a how-not-to book.
The Bible says this too.
Right.
Listen, you could live a lifetime of greatness, of pursuing the will of God, of establishing churches, doing whatever God called you to do. But one sin, according to the word, can destroy much good.
Wow. Right.
So let that set in. That means that God intends for us as his people to always be on guard.
To be on guard. I think of Uzziah, remember in Chronicles, I think it's Second Chronicles, where he rules well for 52 years and then he messes up at the very end and then, he's struck down. So that's interesting. Now we have to move ahead because Judges, listen to me. Judges doesn't just have one messy personality. It's a mess upon mess upon mess. So let's talk about Jephthah. I edited an entire book analyzing Jephthah's daughters, and I'm not going to I'm trying not to go into too much of my own meanderings. But Jephthah, you have this man who he was the son of a prostitute. He was the illegitimate son of someone who apparently was very wealthy in Gilead, which is on the eastern side of the Jordan, right? That's where the Gadites and the Reubenites and half of the tribe of Manasseh, they were in that separate group that was on the east side of Manasseh. But Jephthah, he's raised by a prostitute.
His mother was.
Yeah. His mother was a prostitute.
So that lets you know there.
Right.
What kind of
education he got.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And then his he hangs out. He finds a home among the vain men of Tob. These criminals, right? But then here's how to read this, I think, because Jephthah ends up very tragically, and he's the opposite of being anything like a good educator because he actually destroys his own family. His daughter dies because of his complete poor government and poor self-government. But what's interesting is the way he gets involved in the whole mess is that his half-brothers approach him and they say to him,
his two half-brothers.
Yeah, the two half-brothers, they come and they say to him, we need you to save Israel because you're tough and none of us can deliver it. So we're going to come to the bastard son of our dad who had an affair with a prostitute.
Right.
And he says, well, you kicked me out. You wouldn't even respect me. And then now you want me to come and save you. And so he says, I'll only do it if you make me king over Israel.
But listen to this, though. In verse 3, the second half of it, it says, worthless men gathered around Jephthah and went out on raids with him. So that's a prime example of the company that you keep.
Right.
So it doesn't matter if you get an opportunity to do something great.
Right.
And I like to talk to me and my wife go through this all the time because we see athletes that get tremendous amount of wealth and influence. And then they go out and they do something totally ignorant.
Right. Yeah.
And people are sitting back and say, how could he do that? Because it doesn't matter what influence you have or what amount of things, even though they were willing to give him lordship. The same thing we're talking about, no sense of personal
self-government at all.
Government or personal responsibility.
Right.
So he did exactly what he knew to do. He surrounded himself. And you know what we say about people. If you want to do great things, surround yourself with great people.
Right. No, I can't blame him, though. I mean, the thing about Jephthah is I can't blame him. I mean, he was the son of a prostitute. He was kicked out by his own brothers. He did the best that he could. He was not given the benefit of any kind of education, which is why the tragedy happens, right? Because he goes into battle and he makes this very strange vow, a rash vow, which from the law of Moses, you are not supposed to make. But how would he know that? He wasn't taught the law of Moses. He's riding into battle against the Ammonites and he says, Lord, if you give me victory, then I will sacrifice as a living sacrifice, as a holocaust to you, the first living thing that comes out the side of the house. And what comes out the side of the house? His only child, his daughter. She comes out of the house, right? And you can see the grief because this is his only progeny. We don't have any mention of his wife. This is his only child that is left. And he rips his clothes and he goes into great distress. And he says, I can't do this. I've given a vow to the Lord. And his daughter says, you must do as you have vowed to the Lord. So just give me 4 months or 2 months, I think it is, to go to the mountains and to mourn my virginity, which basically is the fact that she's never going to be a mother. And she comes back and he kills her, right? He did exactly. Now, some interpreters say, no, she was just consecrated as a, as a virgin forever or whatever, whereas others would say, no, if the Bible says that he did as he vowed, it means that he actually did kill her.
Yeah.
But this, talk about not being able to pass on your victory to the next generation, not being able to pass on. And he literally kills his children because of a complete lack of judgment and of discernment. But I guess the question that I would have with the case of Jephthah is that his fault, or is it his brother's fault, or is it Israel's fault?
Well, I would say it's his fault because let's look at his situation. If he had denied the responsibility, then he would not have been accountable. But if you take something, regardless of one thing that we got to understand as it pertains to Scripture, and even like if you right now don't have a valid driver's license, you don't know the law, what it takes to drive in a country or in a state. You jump in a car and start driving, the police pull you over. Is it acceptable for you to reply to the police, I didn't know I needed a driver's license? Would that get you off?
If I lived in a society that okay,
because ignorance, according to the law of any land, is no excuse.
But if I had lived I'm just going to play devil's advocate.
Okay.
I hate to use that term, but I'm just saying, because I have a heart for Jephthah. I don't know why. I feel bad. I feel bad for this brother because if you think about him, if I lived in a society that had treated me like an outcast and had tossed me out and would not accept me because of who my mother was, and they never educated me, then I think I could say to the policeman, you can't give me a ticket because this is part of an agreement, of a legal agreement you have with everyone in society, and I was denied all that. You know what I mean? So I feel like it's not totally his fault. You just don't buy it.
I don't, because ignorance is no excuse for breaking the law.
Yeah.
And let's give another example, more biblical.
Okay.
You remember when they captured the Ark of the Covenant.
Right.
And they were bringing the Ark of the Covenant back. And I can't remember his name at the moment, but he stumbled.
Right.
And he reached to grab, just to hold himself up.
Right.
And he grabbed the Ark of the Covenant.
Right.
And boom, falls dead.
He falls dead. Falls dead.
Why? Because ignorance is no excuse.
All right. So and the thing about it is that, if he had spent time in prayer, at least, if he had a spirit of, if Jephthah had a spirit of submission to the Holy Spirit, then even after having made the rash vow, I think he could have come before the Lord and said, please, what atonement can I do for the vow? And that wouldn't require me to kill my children.
I think,
he made the mistake and then he makes his children pay for his mistake.
But even if he made that mistake, I believe that if he had went to God and said, God, forgive me for that vow that I made, I think God would have released him from that vow.
Yeah, I agree.
I don't think God would have made him kill his daughter because that's something he said. God didn't request that from him.
Right.
He came up with that on his own accord. And now, because he was trying to prove something, like people who offer these fleece, God, if you do this for me, you know, people say all the time, God, if you do this for me, if you get me out of this.
Right. Yeah.
God says to them in return, hey, there's no, you know, hey.
How trifling that you have to believe that God is to think that he really only gave you victory for his people in exchange for the life of your own daughter. I mean, how you know, could you ever think that lowly of God, that you think that the God that you serve would think in those terms?
I guess we're bringing things back. We're coming to some place of agreement on this.
Yeah, I think we are. I think the major point is that you're seeing so many flavors of bad of leadership mistakes. Okay, and then we go from Jephthah, who ends up killing 42,000 people of you know other Israelites. It becomes a huge mess, but he dies without any lasting children that survive him. And then we get to Samson. Now, what do you do with Samson? Here you have someone who he is born because of the incredible prayer of his parents. You know, his parents, they begged for a child, and God blesses them with the child. They set him apart as a Nazirite. You know, we talked about the vow of the Nazirite when we discussed the book of Numbers, where that came up. And so he was supposed to be set aside as the most holy of God, and God gives him so much blessing, so much providential victory. And then what happens?
You know, when you study, and I'm doing a teaching right now in my church on the 7 covenants.
Right.
And so with a covenant comes terms, right? And also within those covenant comes promises.
Right.
Now, you look at one of the things that Samson was forbidden to do was to take a wife outside of.
Right.
And so Samson, like we're talking about, no self-government.
Yeah.
He allowed his passions. He allowed his mind to drive him. And that's what they say about all the women. And come on, you can't find one.
You can't find one, right?
That you gotta go. And so we see here that it's not just a decision of a woman, but it's a decision of choice that he don't want to correct things in his own heart.
Right.
And that's what any of us, you know, we have a saying, and you may have heard it before, that sin will take you further than you want to go. Keep you longer than you want to stay.
Right.
And cost you more than you're willing to pay.
Right. Yeah.
So that's why self-governing is so important. And we see that with Samson.
Right.
Because he didn't have a lot, like you said, his life was laid out for success.
Yeah. And he did the job that he was sent to do at the beginning, right? Because he has victory over the Philistines. And so he could have been a lesson of God's blessing, of God's promise. He could have been a walking honor to teach future generations, because if he had kept the Nazirite vows, right, and if he had been able to keep that state of victory that he was in, but instead what he ends up doing is he ends up being ashamed to his parents and ashamed to God. I mean, he ends up, because he is
to the nation of Israel.
Yeah, he is blinded. And then, you know, when he, at that end, when the end, because, you know, he's betrayed by Delilah. I'm sure everyone, you know, knows the story about, you know, how he cut his hair.
Well, let's go a little deeper, because sometimes people, I'm surprised that we think the generations that we grew up with are very, very open.
Right.
And understanding what we're talking about. You go a few generations. Sometimes I'm amazed when I'm telling stories in the Bible and I ask the question of my church, how many of y'all know the story of you know, just general things?
Oh, they don't know it sometimes?
It's amazing.
Oh, okay. Well, Samson, he's not supposed to marry outside.
Correct.
And he gets into a lot of trouble with women. He's a Nazirite, so he's not even supposed to be drinking. He's not supposed to be touching anything dead. And he breaks that rule because he eats honey out of the dead lion's carcass.
And that was a very, very crucial point in the story.
Right. Yeah. Because so he's breaking a lot of the rules. I get the feeling when I read it that his parents, they had wanted a boy so much that once he came, they didn't understand that you have to discipline.
So you think neglect was the problem?
I think that they spoiled him a little bit, even though they set him aside as a Nazarite. Because you have to think, if you're praying and praying and praying and you're infertile and then that child comes, it might be easy to just be so happy that you have a child that you kind of spoil him. And in fact, the fact that he was kind of spoiled because he was so successful, he had that strength. But anyways, he meets this woman named Delilah who she keeps on trying to figure out what the secret of his strength is. Of course, the secret is his hair.
Correct.
And
after many failed attempts,
she nags and nags and nags.
Correct.
Until finally he tells her, "It's my hair. If you cut my hair," which of course the first thing she does is the minute he falls asleep, she cuts his hair, right? And she brings in the Philistines.
But let's look at how Delilah got into his heart.
Right.
That's key. Because the Bible said Samson in the beginning was protecting his heart.
Yeah.
He concealed those things from Delilah.
Right.
But Delilah would come to him with tears and express to him. Now you set yourself in the middle of this story on a rock listening to this. Delilah would come to him in tears and cry and say, "See, you don't love me."
Right, yeah.
Because if you love me, you would tell me all of your heart. She was putting pressure on him, but Samson did everything in his own power to conceal the secret thing that he knew would be the ultimate thing that would cause him to fail,
right,
to lose everything. He knew it. So he fought with it, but that's the thing we're talking about. If you mess around with sin,
right,
often enough and long enough, pretty soon that sin will become you.
Right.
And that's what happened, because Samson lost the battle. He began to reveal, according to the word, his whole heart.
Yeah, right. Well, and what is so sad, by the time you get to the story of Samson, what I am struck with, reading this through the eyes of an educator, is that none of these leaders learned any of the lessons from the leaders that came before them.
None.
Even the mistakes, they could have learned from the mistakes. But there's no, I guess I hate to use a word that is as plain as communication, but there's no communication from one generation to the next. There's no, as I said, they're always just responding to whatever the crisis is in the minute. And that eventually shapes the character of the people of Israel. Because then even after Samson, you get the story with Micah, and then you get that horrific story, which I'd rather not go through because, I just ate. I don't want to talk about the ending of the book of Judges with the woman getting cut up. And, I mean, the depths of the sickness, of the depravity, and
we can get to without.
Yeah, but I think that partly it is that even the heroes that they had to look up to during this period were heroes that only reacted in the moment. And so there was not a sense of deliberation. There was not a sense of historical memory. There was not a real sense of judgment or discernment, which is ironic because the book is named Judges, and yet that's exactly what they're not good at. They're not good at judging, So are you kind of with me that this is the epitome of a how not to book?
I totally can agree with that statement. That if we can learn anything from the leaders of that time, is we don't want to follow them.
Yeah, right.
And just a few that we've covered, we see that they had tremendous opportunities presented to them, but they failed to capitalize on any of them. And they failed not because they didn't have the potential.
Right, yeah.
And I like to use this story sometimes when I'm talking to my church. And I remember when I was a young fella playing football, and I remember a story of a coach of mine, because I was a very good football player, but I would allow people around me to affect the way I practice and train. because I wanted to always be a,
Right.
So I wouldn't give my all. And one time my coach came to me, grabbed me by my face mask, and looked me in his face, and he said, Devon, you have a lot of potential, but you lack discipline.
Right.
It changed my life. And see, that's what I see with all these guys. They all had tremendous potential, but no discipline. Think of it. Your child has potential, but what do they lack in order for that potential to be fulfilled?
Right.
Discipline.
Yeah.
If you don't have discipline, and Samson, a man that his mama and dad prayed for and cried for, and God gave them the desires of their heart, but he lacked discipline. And that could go back to what you said. They spoiled him.
Right. Yeah.
They failed to put the things in him that was necessary for him to reach his full potential.
Right.
And so the book of Proverbs says a child left alone will bring his mother's much shame. And so I believe that, they had great potential. They lacked discipline. Therefore, they all were an example in many of the stories of what we should not and never do.
Yeah. I think it's the way I would look at it too is whether it's the parents or the authority figures. I also want to read the part where Micah thinks that he can hire a priest. Over this is one of the weirdest parts of it's not one of the most gory parts, but I'll read this part. This is in Judges 17. There was a man from the hill country of Ephraim named Micah, and he said to his mother, the 1,100 pieces of silver taken from you, that I heard you utter a curse about. And here I have the silver with me. I took it. So now I return it to you. Then his mother said, my son, you are blessed by the Lord. He returned the 1,100 pieces of silver to his mother, and his mother said, I personally consecrate the silver to the Lord for my son's benefit to make a carved image overlaid with silver. So he returned the silver to his mother, and she took 5 pounds of silver and gave it to a silversmith. He made it into a carved image overlaid with silver, and it was in Micah's house. This man Micah had a shrine, and he made an ephod and household idols and installed one of his sons to be his priests. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did whatever he wanted. There was a young man, a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah, who resided with the clan of Judah. The man left the town of Bethlehem in Judah to settle wherever he could find a place. On his way, he came to Micah's home in the hill country of Ephraim. Where do you come from? Micah asked. He answered, I am a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah, and I am going to settle wherever I can find a place. Micah replied, stay with me and be my father and priest, and I will give you 4 ounces of silver a year, along with your clothing and provisions. The Levites were the ones who were empowered to pass on the law. If anyone was supposed to be passing on education, it was the Levites. So you have the mother failing. He doesn't seem to have a father because he's asking this person, will you be my father and
my priest?
Or priest. So all of the authority figures in Judges have no concept whatsoever of an obligation to discipline or to train or to even pass on knowledge or insights to the next generation. It's astounding. The entire book is all about all of the authority, all of the parent figures. You have the guy who kills his daughter. You have the ones who spoil Samson. You have Gideon, who can't raise his own sons. And then, I mean, where are good parents? Where are good priests? Where would we draw teachers from in this? So no one's teaching anyone anything in this book. It's astounding.
It is. And when you read this verse that you just ended with, in 11 it says, and agreed to live with Micah, the young man became like one of Micah's sons. Micah ordained the Levite. So the young man became his priest and a part of his family. So you see here, if we think of this in modern day, and you can think of situations in our culture right now where there is a group of people that are suffering from a lack of fathers.
Right. Yeah.
And you can see, and I'll say it because I'm black. I'm a black man. And there's, out of all of the races in the world, the race that suffers the most from lack of fathership, a father in their life, is the blacks in America. We say 76% of the children being born are being born to single mothers. So we see, and what do you see in the black community? You see over and over repetitiveness of failure in our young men. Failing in the school system. They're failing on being providers for their own families. They're producing children, but they're passing down the same.
Well, and I think that's what's so hard because, you know, the black community, I'll just use the term black, you know what I mean? I mean, the black community, and I'm part black because in Puerto Rico, you know, we were descendants of slaves. The races from Africa, they went through so much. They have such a history of overcoming. And that it's the same thing with the book of Judges. We run the risk of those victories not being able to get passed down to the next generation. That there's a broken link. You know, you have your character built up through all that trial and tribulation, and then you just can't pass it down. You can't close the deal. You know what I'm saying? Which is what happens in Judges, where they overcome all of these tribulations, and then they just can't pass that down to the next. Even with Samson's parents, you know, they overcome all that grief for all those years of not being able to have a child, and then they have a child, and then it ends up, you know, in such tragedy. You know, and Samson, I don't think has children, does he? So
no.
So Samson's parents end up again not being able to have a lasting legacy. So it is sad. It's that question of, and this is what I'm going to take away from the book of Judges that tells us about education, is it is important always as educators to think of what we do as that link from one generation to the next. And if that link, it's not like that link is just there and it's yours to break or to not break. You have to build it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You can't take it for granted.
No. And we see that because the Bible says the only reason Abraham was chosen. You think of Abraham, 75 years old, when God found him.
And then he had so many kids.
And then the only thing that the Bible says that he chose him because he said he would teach his children. So it wasn't because he was good looking. It wasn't because he had all the ducks in a row. It wasn't because he was the smartest tool in the shed. Abraham was committed to one thing. And for that thing alone, that shows you the connection that God has with generation after generation. He said Abraham would teach his children. So when you talk about educating a generation or educating an individual or educating your household, if you commit to that, there is no limit to what God can do for you or will do on your behalf.
I agree with you. That it puts such a burden on the shoulders, because I've always read Judges. I've always understood that this was a book that demonstrated failure, that demonstrated wickedness, that demonstrated a betrayal of God's of the covenant that they had made with God. But I've never thought of it quite in this way. That the repeating failure is that you get your victory and then it vanishes because you haven't found a way to pass it on to the people who come later on. And you know, you think of the people who they have that one big win. You know, they're Academy Award winner, you know, and or you know, they're a great general and they win a war. But if you can't pass on some of that gift to the people who come after you, then you know, and after all of the centuries, even your name ultimately won't necessarily
be forgotten.
You think of, you know, and it all goes back in my mind to Ehud with the ambidextrous thing with his hands. I mean, he had that gift in the moment. I don't know. I just wanted to see, you know, him at some point say to everybody, hey, this is how I do it. Like, when you're up against a guy, you got to use your brain, try to train both your hands. But he doesn't seem to, he never, we never see that. And we never see that in any of the judges. They don't take the time. I mean, certainly not with Gideon.
No, definitely.
He has this great moment.
Well, Gideon had 70 sons of his own.
Right. Yeah.
Can you imagine?
Yeah.
The responsibility.
Well, with that many wives, I mean,
70 kids.
Yeah,
70.
yeah. He probably had,
and not one of them you could pull out and invest in for your future.
Right. Yeah. It's
a sad way to end your life.
Well, it's a big burden that rests on the shoulders of teachers, because I think that education is the key to the question: are you going to be a Judges kind of country, or are you going to be a Joshua kind of?
That's good.
Are you going to be? Are you playing the game of Joshua, or are you playing the game of Judges? And that's the tough question. Now we're going to get next week to somewhat more cheerful topics, because we're going to be doing the book of Ruth, which is a short book, but you can talk about it for a long time. It's a lot less disturbing. Do you forgive me for not wanting to go over the end of the book of Judges?
Not at all.
The ending is so brutal. And, I mean, how do you, as a pastor, how do you even relate that part of the Bible to people? It is so pornographic. I mean,
I think sometimes the realities of what's in the Word has to be on display. Because when you look at Judges, and this is something that touches deep in me, because with the human nature, it's in our best interest to conceal certain things.
Yeah.
And so when we see things like the way Judges is ending, our natural mind, the part of us that are human, wants to conceal that. But just think about God, who was responsible for articulating this to the author.
Yeah.
And making sure that it made it into the Bible.
Right.
God has no concern with how things make him look. He wants the truth to be told, because it's the truth that we know that is going to give us the freedom we need to live in victory.
Yeah, amen.
And so when we hear the story of Judges and how it ends and things that are happening, the truth of the matter is God wants this to be spread to the next generation.
Right, because otherwise then we have the problem we've been talking about. If you don't face how ugly that was, then you lose whatever insights you could have gained from that. Because in the end, the tribe of Benjamin does not disappear.
Nope.
So as disgusting as that is, it ends with a victory, a turnaround of sorts, a reversal. But then we get to the book of Ruth, which is a great book, and which tells us about one of the ancestors of Jesus.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you as well,
Pastor, and thank you everyone who tuned in. And we will be up again